5.9 million adults are highly sleep disturbed by environmental noise in Europe. There are 69,000 hospital admissions per year as a result of environmental noise in Europe, and 15,900 deaths per year as a result of exposure to environmental noise in Europe. Bernard.
Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me with this? Yes. I would like to welcome you very much to this session on noise, the hidden killer, and what we can do in order to mitigate its impact. Just a few housekeeping rules from my side. First of all, you have translation here. That means you can speak and listen in English, French, and German. But for this, you need a headset, which most of you probably have. Those who are not having it, you need to go downstairs where you can find them. Second thing I would like to ask you is to please switch off your mobile phones, or at least put them in silent mode. This is also important for our technical colleagues here. We will not use ConnexMe, which is the app for this event. I think we have enough technique in this session that we don't need additional, and there's no big voting, but of course you'll be free to ask questions and raise your hand. I would also like to remind you that at the end of the session, please return your headsets if you have taken some, and also fill out the survey to let us know what you felt about this. This is all I wanted to say from my side. One last thing is, if you ask questions or if you intervene in whatever way, you need to be aware that this session is web streamed. So if you intervene, you kind of give consent that you're web streamed. Well, this leaves me with introducing our speakers and our technical support people. Stephen Turner, and he's assisted by Paul Shields and Alex Southern. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. And from my point of view, welcome to this session on noise. As Bernhard said, I'm supported by Paul Shields, who's lurking in the middle of the audience, Alex Southern at the back, and Louis Cowell over there, and you will see what part they will play in this presentation as we go on. So, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about what is sound, and then when does sound become noise that can damage our health? And then we're going to look at some of the adverse effects that exposure to noise can cause. And probably most importantly, the measures we have available to fight noise and reduce the numbers of people affected that I mentioned right at the start. Now, this is going to be an informal and interactive session. There is going to be a part for you to play in it at one point. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along, especially if I say something you don't understand, or even if I say something that you don't agree with. So, we hear sound. You are hearing the sound of my voice at the moment. Those with headsets are hearing the sound of the interpreter's voice in their ears. Hopefully, you are enjoying what you're hearing. But if I was suddenly to start shouting at you like that and to continue doing so for the rest of the session, I suspect your enjoyment wouldn't be so great. And that sound of me shouting has turned into noise. So we hear sound, and noise is unwanted sound. But is it simply a question of how loud the sound is that turns it into noise? Well, let's see. We're going to play 3 sounds to you, and we'd like you to listen to all 3 and decide which one you like the most, which one you like the least, and which you thought was the loudest. So, the first sound is coming now. Alex? So that was the first sound. Now let's listen to the second one. And finally, the third sound.
Touching me, touching you, sweet Caroline. Good times never seem so good. I've been inclined to believe there never was, but now
Right, you heard three sounds. Which one did you like the most? Hands up who liked the first sound. And this is the one you liked the most. Not just liked, but liked the most. Right, let's try again. Which one did you like the most? Right, the first one. Okay, now what about who liked the second one the most? And finally, who liked the third one the most? So I think the first one just shaded it in terms of liking the most. Right, now the other end. Who liked the first one the least? The least. And the second one, the least. And the third one, the least. I think the third one might have just had the least popular vote. And finally, who thought the first one was the loudest? And who thought the second one was the loudest? And who thought the third one was the loudest? So what do we learn from that little... Sorry?
All were the same. Yeah.
Did you? Right. Well,
The same.
no, that's right. That's very well observed. We'll just press pause on that for a moment. So, the results. The like and dislike, partly how we react to sound, depends on our personal preferences, matter of taste, matter of likes and dislikes, and so on. And just for information, the first one was Mozart, the second one was Daft Punk, and the third one was Neil Diamond. So, what that means is that what can be sound for some people, those who liked the second one, and there are others who didn't like the second one, it was the same sound, but the attitude and your response to it was different. And that comes with how we interpret sound and turn it into noise. But as that gentleman carefully observed, and he must have a calibrated ear, they were actually all the same sound level. And all a meter can do is measure the sound level. It can't tell whether it's Daft Punk and we like it. It can't tell whether it's Mozart and we don't like it. It just measures the sound. So what we have in the middle, Paul is standing by it and perhaps could point to it, is a sound level meter. And up on the screen, which I can't quite see, but just nod Paul, is it up there now? And hopefully you can see how the level is going up and down with me talking, and if I was to clap my hands, can you see how the level changes? So all the sound level meter is doing is measuring the level of sound. It's giving us no information about our likes and dislikes and our attitude to it. So I think the most popular one actually was the Mozart. So Louis, could you set it up so we can just have the sound level meter measuring the Mozart? Are you ready to go? And Alex, if you could play the left-hand one. up on the screen there was the level of sound from the Mozart. But it didn't tell us anything about those who liked it, those who didn't. And that's one of the key things about sound and noise. We as individuals and our attitude to the sound affects our response to it. Now, courtesy of the good old British Broadcasting Corporation, we've got a video here that shows what happens when the sound wave goes into our ear. So let's have a look at that. So what that video shows, that our brain is involved in the sounds we hear and how we process them. And because of that, that's what we got, that spreader response about the likes and dislikes of those three examples we had earlier. And the context and our attitude to the cause of the sound affects whether or not we perceive it as noise. But having said that, most of us agree that this is noise. So if I could have the left-hand one, please. And the second one. And the third one. That's what we call environmental noise, and that's the hidden killer that is the subject of the talk: exposure to road traffic noise, railway noise, and aircraft noise. But is it always our attitude to it, whether or not we like the sound of aircraft or like the sound of railways? Well, no, it isn't. And to understand this, we need to go back to the Stone Age. So imagine you are part of a Stone Age family sitting around the campfire, and then all of a sudden you hear a sound. What is it? The unconscious flight-fight reaction occurs. Is it a danger? Do I need to run away? Should I stand and fight? Or is it nothing to worry about? You have to have that reaction very, very quickly. You can't think about it. It's an instinctive, physiological reaction. Because if you do think about it, and it actually turns out to be a danger, it could be too late with fatal results. And when you have that reaction, your heart rate increases, there's greater cardiac output, and your blood pressure goes up. And that happens when we hear all sounds to a greater or lesser extent. There is this unconscious impact on us of sounds that we hear. And it goes, as I said, right back to the Stone Age. So we've got two types of noise. We've got sound that becomes noise when we just don't like it and it gets in the way. And we've also got sound which is noise because our body reacts in an adverse way to it. So let's now try to summarize how sound becomes noise and how it affects us. So first of all, we have the sound. Now, one aspect that's not the subject of this talk, but is nonetheless important, is sound that ultimately can give you noise-induced hearing loss. And that's when literally you go deaf because of too much exposure to high levels of noise. It happens most often in the workplace, and for many years there have been regulations controlling the noise exposure in the workplace. And if you go into factories, you will see signs advising people to put ear defenders on. And all businesses that generate noise have to assess whether or not their employees are at risk. The other aspect of noise-induced hearing loss happens in the entertainment industry. And many of the rock musicians who were famous in the 1970s and 1980s are now profoundly deaf because of the high levels of sound they had on stage and the exposure to it. And one or two of them, to their great credit, now do occasionally advise people to take care of their hearing when listening to loud music, because loud music can damage your hearing. You might notice on your phones and tablets that when you play music and you try to turn the volume up too high, especially on headphones, it gives you a warning. And that's the reason, because long-term exposure to high levels of noise like that can give you hearing damage. There was also a fallacy that occurred in the 70s and 80s, that if you like what you're listening to, it doesn't damage your hearing. Well, it is a fallacy. It is all about how much sound energy is getting into the ear, not whether or not you like it. So that's noise-induced hearing loss. But what we're concerned about today is everyday environmental sounds. And you hear the sound, and what sort of effect can it have on us? I am sure you've all experienced distraction, speech interference. You're talking to somebody and then a train goes past, you can't hear each other for a few moments. You lose concentration, you're trying to focus on a task and some noise gets in the way and distracts you. And then there's sleep disturbance, where noise either wakes you up or stops you from getting to sleep. And that is another effect. Now, the extent to which that affects us depends on us as individuals. As we showed earlier, some people didn't like one of those samples and other people liked it. It's the same for all sounds and noise. The extent to which it affects us in terms of distraction, sleep interference, sleep disturbance and so on is entirely an individual characteristic. I could not predict for any one of you in this room how a certain sound would affect you. But if you have enough of that disturbance, distraction, speech interference and so on, it will then give you the sensation of annoyance. And that's one of the outcomes of exposure to noise. You are physically annoyed by it and you just really don't like it. And there are degrees of annoyance that people experience. But again, how you are annoyed and how severe is the annoyance depends on you. So again, I could not play a sound and tell you how annoyed you as an individual would be. It's entirely down to your makeup, your background, and so on. So that's the effect that happens that you're aware of. You're consciously aware of the disturbance, and then you become annoyed by it. But then there's this other route, if you like the Stone Age route, where the noise happens and your body just reacts to it that you're not aware of. Rather sort of complicated phrase, what's written there, non-cognitive biological responses. And if you have enough of those, that can lead to health effects, increased blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, heart attack and stroke. And it really is only over the last 15 years or so that researchers have found an association between high levels of noise exposure, environmental noise exposure, so road traffic, aircraft and so on, and those sort of outcomes. But again, whether or not that happens to you as an individual depends on who you are and your personal physiological characteristics. So not everybody who's exposed to high levels of sound will have that increased risk. It depends on you as an individual. The analogy is that not everybody who smoked got lung cancer. It depended on the person. Even being disturbed by noise can have a health effect. So there's a link from the disturbance to those health effects. And likewise, if you're annoyed by it as well, you can get those effects as well. And then finally, with annoyance, that does lead to people to complain about noise. And there are people who complain about noise because they're just fed up with it, they're annoyed by it, and they feel that somebody ought to do something about it. But again, whether or not a person complains depends on the individual. So as I've said earlier, I could not predict whether any one of you would complain about a certain noise that you hear. So that diagram shows roughly how sound affects us. And there are the two routes. The one that goes straight across the screen, which is the cognitive route, the route that we're aware of, and then you've got the non-cognitive route above it. So that when you have come across somebody who's living next to a major road, a busy road, and they say, oh, don't worry about the noise, I'm used to it. Oops, oh, no, did I do that? Could you get me back onto... I'll just go through it again. So say, I'm used to the noise. Well, they might have got a strategy to cope with the awareness of it and the effect it has on them, but it still means they could be susceptible to the health effects through that non-cognitive biological response going to that route. So we've got noise all around us, and we know we've got these effects. How on earth do we quantify it? Well, this is where the European Commission stepped in, and in 2002 issued a noise directive called the Environmental Noise Directive, and required member states to generate noise maps. And noise maps had to be generated for agglomerations, that's the big urban areas, and then for major roads, major railways and major airports in countries. And that's an example of the noise map in Scotland. And as you can see, there are different colours on that map, which represent different exposures to noise, and the key is on the right-hand side. So what does it sound like to live in the orange area, which is around about 55 dB? So let's play all of this sample. And what about the purple area, which is around about 65, about 10 dB higher? And finally, the light blue area, which is another 10 dB higher still. So the question then is, at what exposure do those effects I've started talking about start to be seen? Well, let's look first of all at the non-cognitive, the effect that we're not aware of. And these are the levels which roughly the research suggests the risk of these health effects start to occur. So let's have the left-hand sample, please. Now the middle one. And finally, So if you lived in a house where the level outside your door was roughly those levels we heard in the room just now from either road traffic, railways or aircraft, that's when the risk of those non-cognitive health effects start to occur, and some people might be subjected to increased blood pressure or cardiovascular disease. And that's the sort of route that we're getting some of that evidence of the mortality that I mentioned right at the start.
May I have a question?
Yes, you may indeed.
Yeah, thank you. This vicinity here, thank you. This area here. Okay, you hear me? This house here is very close to the highway. It's very close to one of the most crowded areas of Brussels. I think it's more than the 55. It's definitely maybe more towards the 70 or 75. Do we hear anything of this traffic here inside the house? We have here a house. It's very much dependent how the house is constructed. We are not living 8 hours or 24 hours a day outside the house. So it's a little bit too simplistic what you explained. Thank you.
Just wait a moment. Let us stay outside, because actually the research is based on external levels, and the research is suggesting that it doesn't matter the extent to which the house is constructed, how it's constructed, and I'll explain why in a moment. Back to our diagram and the levels. Now, the levels that tend to cause people to really feel distracted and start to drift into annoyance are these. So if we could have the left-hand one, please. And the second one. And the third one. So those are the sort of levels outside a building that we start to see the effects of annoyance on people who live in places exposed to that. So pick up that gentleman's comment. Let's now go indoors. Now, firstly, let's look at road traffic when indoors. If on the left-hand sound, that's outside the property. So if we could hear that. Let it run for its full extent. Now we're indoors with our windows partially open, so let's have the right-hand one. No. That gives you about a 13 decibel reduction from outside to inside a house with windows partially open. Let's play that one again, which is the left-hand one. And now we've shut the windows. Let's have the right-hand one. So if you have good sound insulation, good windows, you can almost render the traffic inaudible indoors, which is what the gentleman was referring to. If you go on to the next slide and play that one again. But staying indoors with the windows shut isn't the solution. We like to open our windows, especially on hot days. And of course, we need to go outside. And the moment we go outside, that's what we hear. And we think it's because, keep the sound going. We think it's because that we hear that outside, and we know the moment we open our front door, that is what we hear, causes the effects that I've been describing, even though indoors with windows shut, you can barely hear it. And let's see how that goes with railways. So first of all, we're outside with a train going past. And now indoors with the windows partly open. And now if we just have that one again, we're indoors, windows partly open. And now we've shut the window. So again, with windows shut, we can barely hear the train while we're indoors. But, as I said earlier, if we're indoors with the windows shut, and then we move outdoors, that's what we hear. And finally, the same with aircraft. The reason why there's not an aircraft in the picture, of course, you won't usually see the aircraft when you're looking straight out the window, because it's up high above you. So let's hear the aircraft as if we were outdoors. And now we're indoors with the windows partly open. As I'm sure you're getting used to this, let's just play the right-hand one now with the windows shut. So once again, with the window shut, you can barely hear the sound of the aircraft when it's outside. But if you are outside, let's just have the right-hand one. So whilst it would be attractive to think, oh, that's right, we can just solve the problem of environmental noise by encouraging people to stay indoors and keep their windows shut, of course that isn't the answer. As I said earlier, people will want to open their windows, and the evidence suggests that even knowing that the moment you go outdoors and you hear the sound, whether it's road traffic or railways passing or aircraft flying overhead, that affects your response and the health risks that might occur. So let's now look to how we might manage environmental noise, and we're going to focus on road traffic because it is the most prevalent noise source that affects Europeans. And we've got 4 ways we can manage road traffic noise that we're going to particularly look at today. The first is just reducing the noise generated by the individual vehicles. The second is by reducing the speed that the traffic is travelling along the road. The third is to put what is known as a low noise road surface onto the road. And finally, we erect a noise barrier between the road and the affected properties. Now, those different measures can be applied by different bodies and organisations. So, for example, restricting how much noise individual vehicles can make is a European issue. Regulations are applied at the European level to restrict how much noise can be made by individual cars, lorries and motorbikes and so on. Implementing speed limits can be done at a national or a local level. So it can be decided nationally that the speed limit on certain roads, in the UK for example, it's 70 miles per hour. Or locally, local authorities can decide to restrict the speed on certain roads. Putting a low noise road surface down is very much in the gift of the local highway authority. And likewise, erecting a noise barrier is also in the gift of the local highway authority. So you can see there's a range of bodies that can help reduce noise. Right, what benefits do they give? So first of all, let's look at reducing the noise at source. So Louis, can we reset the meter? Alex, could we play the current one, please? And now, with the implementation of that regulation that's listed at the top of the screen, 540/2014, this is the expected benefit of that regulation being implemented. Oh. Well, Marco would like to know if you heard the difference. Hands up who thought it was quieter. And those who didn't. Oh, well, you see, that just goes to prove what we know in acoustics, that a 3 decibel change of a source that is identical is barely discernible. Some of you noticed it, some of you didn't. Now, you might then think, well, this regulation's a bit of a waste of time to get 3 dB off the noise of vehicles that we can barely tell the difference. But that would be a bit unfair on European Commission, because there's been regulations and directives managing the noise from individual vehicles since about 1970. And in that time, over that sort of best part of 50 years, the level of noise from individual vehicles have dropped by at least 10 decibels. It's been done in stages, and the 2014 regulation is the next stage on that, and no doubt more stages will come. Let's move on to now invoking a speed limit, and this is a source with the speed at 100 kilometers per hour, and then we'll hear what it sounds like if we reduce the speed to 60. Okay. And now 60. Who thought the 60 was quieter? This is good, this is good, it's working, because that was a reduction of about 4.5 decibels. And we acoustaticians reckon that 4 to 5 dB people will always hear the difference for the same source. Now, what happens if we combine reducing the source and the speed limit? So the top one is current vehicles, 100 kilometers per hour. So let's go with that. And the bottom one is quieter vehicles at 60. And hopefully you all heard that reduction, and that was about 7.5 dB. So let's now move to low noise road surfaces. Now this is complicated, or it's at least a little more complicated, because all vehicles have primarily two noise sources. They have the engine, and they have the interaction between the tyres and the road surface. And depending on how fast you're going, one or other of those sources will dominate what we hear. At relatively low speeds, it's the engine noise that dominates. But at higher speeds, especially if you're on motorways, what you're hearing is the interaction between the tyre and the road surface. We call it tyre noise. So we have to worry about what the speed is when we want to look at the benefit of a low noise road surface. So here we have the original sound, but at 100 kilometers per hour. So let's have that top one. And now with the low noise road surface. And that's about a 4 dB reduction. And you get that if your original speed is high. Now, there are some people who think, well, let's put low noise road surfaces everywhere, including in cities. It's debatable whether that's good use of money, because now, if we start again, but with the original speed at 50 kilometers per hour, let's hear that. and now with the low noise road surface at 50. Virtually no difference. In fact, it was about 1 dB. So you've got to think about where you apply your measures, especially low noise road surfaces, in order to maximise the benefit. Now onto noise barriers. You will have all seen noise barriers alongside roads. There's our little schematic with our barrier. And let's turn around and have a look at the effect of the noise barrier. So if we have the one on the left, which is our original traffic, and now let's put the barrier up. Barriers actually are very, very simple methods of reducing noise. That was about a 10 dB reduction. And it works simply by blocking the line of sight between you as a receiver and the sources of noise, in this case the traffic and the engines and the tyres. They don't have to be particularly heavy, as long as they are complete and they are high enough. And that's all you need with a barrier. An awful lot of work has gone on refining the research into barriers and trying to optimise the benefit. And I mean, we're not very good at that in the UK, but certainly in continental Europe, there are some fabulous looking barriers that are designed to get the maximum benefit from basically what you heard there, and just to try and get a few more decibels out of it. Now, if we were to go indoors and the barrier, so this left-hand one, indoors, windows partially open, but barrier in place. And then finally, windows shut, indoors, barrier in place. You'll have to be very quiet to listen to this. You'd be hard pushed to know that you were next to a busy road. And of course, if you go out to your front door and the barrier is in place, it is 10 dB quieter than if it isn't. So that's how we can fight noise. At the European level, we limit the noise coming from individual vehicles. At the national, local level, we reduce the speed. At the local level, we put low noise road surfaces down where they will be of benefit. And at the local level also, we can build barriers. Job done. Unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that. When you tackle the noise from individual vehicles, those measures almost inevitably add to the cost of the vehicle. It takes time and money to research and implement. As I said, we've managed about a 10 dB reduction over 50 years. Now, arguably, we could have put more pressure on the motor industry, but if you as the public don't want to pay an extra €1,000 for your motor car because it's a bit quieter, you might choose not to go down that route. So that's why it needs regulation at the European level and to try and get the support of the motor industry. And I bet you can imagine how complicated those discussions can be when you're working through this. If you impose speed limits, yeah, I bet some of you have broken the speed limit when driving a car, even though by accident. It increases journey times if your average speed is lower. And for businesses, anybody delivering anything anywhere, if your speed is restricted, takes longer, increased costs. So would you be prepared to pay more for your food? It's because there is then less noise from the roads. Can you see where this is going? Low noise road surfaces. Well, originally, they were more costly than conventional surfaces and also not as hard wearing, especially of concrete. A concrete road surface is desperately loud. I really don't. It's bad enough in the car, let alone the people outside it. They're also not so hard wearing, at least they weren't, and they have to be replaced more often. So highway authorities think, hang on a minute, if I use this surface, which isn't low noise, I won't have to worry about it for another 20 years. If I use this one, I might have to worry about it again in 10 years. So again, it adds to the cost. The good news is that the technology is improving, and both the wear and the cost of installing it is getting closer to more conventional surfaces. And finally, barriers. Well, barriers spoil the view. There's been research done, and even though you would offer a barrier to people, actually we'll take the noise and enjoy the view. You can sever communities with barriers. You know, imagine a very long fence. You know how you get through it, and of course they also need maintaining. And highway authorities really don't want to carry that burden, especially if money is a bit tight. And this touches on the whole struggle with noise management. We've got to try and find the balance. Because society needs, you and I need industry, we need commerce, we need transport infrastructure. We want to be able to go to places. I couldn't have got here for this presentation without using a train. Some of you would have used cars, some of you might have flown, only a few of you probably came on your bicycle because you live locally. We need trains, we need cars, we need aircraft. But society also needs good health and well-being. And as I showed at the beginning of the presentation, we know that noise adversely affects health because we perceive it and it causes us disruption and disturbance. But we also know that it can cause health effects like heart attacks and cardiovascular disease. Unfortunately, transport causes noise that affects that health. So in the end, we've got to try and strike the balance of managing noise, but still enabling societal needs to be met in terms of commerce and industry and so on. Oh, sorry, could you go back again? I must be touching something.
You have an
Which indeed we do, which we're hearing all about. It's slide 58 we're on. That's right, we have that one. Yeah, okay, I'll do it now. So there's the balance. But as I've touched on, fighting noise is a team effort. There's activities that Europe can do in terms of the noise from individual vehicles, and there are activities that cities can do in terms of speed limits, low noise road surfaces, and barriers. So what happens if we work together? So we have our original noise source on the left, but we've implemented a noise barrier, a low noise road surface, a speed restriction, and a reduction in source. So let's have the left-hand one. And now the right-hand one. I hope you agree that that's a substantial difference by applying all the measures on the right-hand side to the noise source on the left. In fact, that's nearly a 20 decibel reduction. I would argue it must be worth trying to do all those things, because we need to remember, as we said right at the start, we've got 14.1 million highly annoyed due to environmental noise, nearly 6 million highly sleep disturbed, nearly 70,000 hospital admissions due to noise, and nearly 16,000 deaths per year due to exposure to environmental noise. So I hope that's giving you an indication of how we can fight noise, the hidden killer. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And I think we have time for some questions. If you're willing to take some questions, please feel free to ask what you need to know. Yes, please. You may start.
Oh, hi, morning everybody. My name is Jeff Gazzard. I work with environmental NGOs on aviation issues, including noise and human health. Steve, that was great. Very straightforward, easy to understand. I have one question for you on the content and then one kind of strategic question. You put up the bit that on road traffic that if you there may be some issues with lowering speed limits and road hauliers not accepting that. That isn't the case. If you reduce speed limits, particularly on trunk roads and motorways, you actually make more capacity. It depends on how you manage that traffic, so it's not quite the case. Secondly, you went through the kind of synergistic effects very clearly of how all of those measures can reduce noise in a road traffic environment, potentially by 20 dB. Needed maybe some work on the housing and building standards for double glazing. But if you're talking about a cost-benefit analysis, even if you look at the numbers of annoyed, the numbers of hospital admissions, and the numbers of premature deaths, you can put a figure on that. And reducing the noise to the levels that you're suggesting is probably an order of several orders of magnitude higher than, sadly, the costs involved with those kind of impacts. And that's the question that I wanted to ask you about. We've seen these cost-benefit analyses over the years. You've been involved in some of them, so have I. But when you get to that, that's the stumbling block. There are two stumbling blocks. One is it a health issue? The answer is yes, it is. Is it serious? Yes, it is. But when you put figures on that slide, which you can do because that's an accurate slide, then you look at the costs of implementing across the three modes that you said to reduce the levels, that's trillions of euros. So that's my question. Who decides whether that cost is worth it? Thank you.
Well, it's certainly not me, that's for sure. You're quite right. One of the key things about monetising is the fact that the effects of noise, it didn't come across in the presentation, we're on a continuum. There isn't a number, an exposure above which we're all suddenly badly affected. We all gradually get more and more affected to a greater or lesser extent, which actually means that every decibel reduction is worth having from a cost-benefit point of view because you're effectively pulling people, just reducing it a bit. The other interesting thing with noise, and why it's said in the video at the start, it's the second biggest issue after air quality, is because there's an awful lot of us affected to some extent, and that has a cost, and it can be worked out, as you said. Yes, we have that cost. It's one of the tools in the toolbox in terms of arguing it. I personally am not a fan of noise limits. I know our hosts here might not agree with me on that, because I think if you have a limit, to make it work at the moment with noise, you'll end up at a very high level, because trying to set a limit at 50, the world would come to a stop. If you have it at a high level, all we'd end up focusing is trying to avoid people being above that high level and ignoring all the people who are affected to some extent. So I think we're much better just trying to squeeze it down all the time and making the most of opportunities. We have been a little bit in silos. We're worrying about noise. There was a session before us, we're worrying about air quality. Well, can you get the noise map up again of Glasgow while I'm chattering away? An awful lot of the places where there are high noise levels, especially in cities, there are also quite high air quality levels. Let's get back to that map. Oh, just overshot. There we go. Back a bit. That's it. So where all the sort of blue, purple and red lines are following roads. Now, the air pollution on those roads are probably as much of an issue for those who are about air quality as there is noise. So it immediately said, well, wait, hang on a minute, why don't we work together more, air quality and noise people, to look to see what we can do between us to reduce the impact of both noise and air quality. Yeah, people argue the cost that it can't be done, but actually we have reduced noise by 10 dB from cars. It's about 20 dB for aircraft since the early 70s. We have made huge strides. The trouble is there's more to do.
Thank you very much for the reply. Yes, please, next question. Yes.
I'd be very interested to find out what the noise impact would be on a road where only electrical vehicles would be allowed in comparison with what we've heard now, because now we're only basing this analysis on conventional technology, and we're looking at a structural change to accommodate the current technology. We're not looking at the potential benefits of more, up-to-date technologies with a dramatically reduced infrastructural cost.
Thank you for that question. Electric vehicles, my personal view is I think we could be rather disappointed by them from a noise perspective. I said partway through the talk that broadly you have two noise sources from cars. You have the engine and you have the tyres. Electric vehicles deals with the engine. Terrific. So if you are in cities and you're at low speeds, we are going to notice a difference. There is a caveat which I will come on to. Once the speeds get higher, the tyre noise dominates. And if you are relatively close to a motorway where the speeds are high and it's full of electric vehicles, the noise level will barely change from what it is today because the tyre is the main noise source. And that's why I didn't mention it. There is a tyre directive that focuses on trying to get the tyres themselves to be less noisy regardless of the road surface. Now, my caveat about in cities is it is in that regulation that I mentioned earlier. I might get the meaning of the letters wrong. It's AVAS. It's Additional Vehicle Alert System, which broadly says when you are driving an electric vehicle or even a hybrid that's on electric power, you need to add a sound to it so that people know you're there. This has been a great concern to the people representing those who are blind and guide dogs and so on. And that regulation says that from 2020, 2021, all new electric and hybrid cars must have that facility added to them. And there are a lot of people beavering away working out, well, what should that additional vehicle alert system sound like? All we know is it's going to be more sound energy. So all of a sudden, the potential benefits of electric cars from a noise point of view are going to be lost to some extent because of that. And the irony of it is that I think it's up to 20 kilometres per hour. You have to have this thing sounding. And of course, that's not terribly far away from when the tyre noise starts to take over. I think we'll have to watch how that develops. So that's a little bit of a caveat over electric cars.
Thank you very much. Yes, please. Up here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Very interesting talk. Now, going on that, the impact of tires. So what is the impact on the noise of tires and what is the drawback? If you have a very quiet tire, are they less safe or less robust, or what could be the impact?
Well, I haven't got a lot of information on that, other than when I went to replace my tyres a couple of years ago, my local garage was very dismissive of the, in quotes, less noisy tyres because he didn't think they lasted as long. So it was a wearability thing. Oh, Paul, sure.
There's also issues around the functioning of the tyre. If you make it a lot softer, it doesn't stay on the wheel. So there is limits to how much sound you can reduce in it, and we all know an off-road tyre is so much more noisy than a motorway tyre. And then you could make them really slick, but then you have no grip. So there is physical limits both in terms of the tyre just rolling off the wheel and in terms of grip.
But just briefly adding to that, I think there's discussion for the moment in the European Commission on tires, and so I think we can in a few weeks' time maybe get some news on what has developed there. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And once again, very good presentation.
Thank you.
In the end, I was really surprised. You integrate everything very nicely and very easy to understand. One point is missing. Never.
Only one.
Never ever complete. But it's important to me. It's infrastructure.
Yeah.
Infrastructure is another key to manage traffic noise, same as pollutants. We need big city arterial roads to allow people to go from A to B. We can't avoid that. So we have to manage traffic streams to roads where then the noise level can go up, maybe even to 80, 85 decibels, but nobody should live there.
Yeah.
And if we can manage that, we solve another issue, because when we see, especially Brussels is famous for that, with all its congestions are stress. Congestions create more noise. So it is also well-being if we do something for the infrastructure. Thank you.
A very valid point. When one first starts studying acoustics and noise control, one of the early mantras that you are given is prevention is better than cure. So you try to solve the noise problem before it becomes a problem. Planning is prevention. What I was talking about is cure once the planning hasn't quite worked. So you're quite right.
Yes, there are two behind there. Yes, we start on the right side and then on the more left side. No, there.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. I have a simple question, because I select this presentation to hear to implement in our country some measures to minimize the noise. I represent the Minister of Environment, but issues the permit tasks. And in the permit acts, we have to put the conditions to minimize the noise. And now I hear that the type of this technical solution is the barrier. But we have another solution by green or trees barrier too. And it's not enough to reduce the noise, because we have another project in country like a platform for helicopters for hospital. It's placed in the city, and the barrier in this case it's not enough. I want to ask and to the other measures or technical construction it exists or not at the moment. Thank you.
If I understood the question correctly, helicopters and noise barriers, you're quite right. I mean, the biggest example is aircraft noise. Noise barriers are really not a solution for aircraft. If you could go back to the effects diagram, which I think is just above this one. Yeah, that's the one. What causes disturbance and annoyance is not just how loud it is and our attitude to it. There are lots of other effects as well, like when the noise occurs, how often it occurs, what we're trying to do when it occurs. And with things like aircraft and helicopters, because they are discrete events, there is management that could be done about when it occurs. A lot of airports in Europe have restrictions on how many flights there are at night, for example, to manage sleep disturbance. Something like a helicopter for a hospital, we have one in London, which needed very careful assessment. And actually, in the end, although I wasn't, I implied today that it wasn't a solution, we just made sure that the apartments around it had very good sound insulation, so that when they could hear a helicopter was approaching, the windows could be partially open or even shut, and that helped to manage it. There's not a perfect solution for everything until, at source, we can really reduce the noise coming from, say, a helicopter or an aircraft. But again, there will be a limit because the physics says you are moving a large lump of metal through the air. That will inevitably generate little pressure variations, which we will pick up as sound. So there will always be some noise. I think where we are at the moment is there is scope for reducing the noise that we're currently experiencing.
Thank you. The helicopter thing, there is one other thing. The route that the helicopter takes to the hospital. So if you can have a steep path so it gets height quickly and then perhaps goes along a major road away from population centres. So the route that they go to and from the hospital can make quite a big difference rather than overflying large populated areas. But that's not always possible to achieve in a very big city. Yeah.
Okay, I think I had one more question over there in the left side. Yes.
Thank you. That was a suitably annoying presentation. And I mean that as a compliment. Your noises really brought the point home. If the problem is 70 to 90% the tyres, then is there sufficient pressure on the industry to actually maybe consider really innovative solutions, structure within the tyres, alternative materials encasing the tyres? I mean, where is the noise generated? I mean, surely that has to be the cheapest option if 70 to 90% is coming from the tyres, and tyres are relatively cheap compared with the cost of a vehicle, and probably nobody really cares because as long as it's quiet in the car, who cares what's going on? I mean, I'm being slightly facetious there. But.
I mean, you're quite. I mean, ironically, when low noise road services first came in, which of course is part of the tyre and road interaction. I always thought I was much more aware of it when I was driving inside my car. Oh, I'm going over a low-noise road service because it sounded so different inside the car. I mean, Bernhard said that there's work in Europe at the moment looking at tyres. You're quite right. It's a question of encouraging and raising the importance of noise. The UK minister who was responsible for noise back around the turn of 2000, so nearly 20 years ago, described noise as a Cinderella pollutant. I actually still think it is the Cinderella pollutant. It's not given enough prominence, even though we have all this data. And if we could try and just get society to recognise the issue with noise, then the pressure would come that we've really got to do something about noise, and the sort of innovative solutions you're talking about might start to emerge.
Thank you very much. Yes, two questions. First here in the fifth row, and then... Well, we can start there also. If it's fine for you, we start there and we work our way towards. No. Sorry, because he has the micro already. Yeah. No, go ahead.
Thank you very much. It's not really a question that I would have, just because I'm working in the European Commission on the matter of sound emissions from vehicles. So you know who to blame about that now. Yeah, I would like to thank you for your presentation. Indeed, it's very global presentation on what happens. Just to give a couple of comments, remarks, if you wish. You mentioned the regulation 540/2014 on the sound emissions by motor vehicles. This concerns indeed passenger vehicles and goods vehicles. There is also work that is done on the so-called L category vehicles, roughly motorcycles, motorbikes, mopeds. We need a new step, as we call it now, for a better sound emission level, better limits from that. But it's not all that we have in these noise regulations. We also have things that concern the testing of the vehicles. We wish to improve them. We wish to improve the testing so as to simulate as much as possible the real driving conditions. If someone has heard about the RDE, the real driving emissions of the engine emissions, we try to do something like that, but not that heavy in the whole procedure at this stage. We work together at international level with UNESA, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and we follow closely this work and the regulations there. For tires, we have, for the time being, a separate regulation that includes all the aspects of them. And so, in this case, we see how the phase-in of the new limits of the tires for all their characteristics, namely the rolling noise, the wet grip, and the rolling resistance can get in and how they will behave, so we can introduce whatever is necessary for the noise emissions of vehicles from the tires in our further studies and steps for reducing the noise from vehicles. And the little thing that you said about Havas, yes, that's a very good step, and indeed already from next year we need within a year from now, more or less, the vehicles, electric and hybrid ones, to be equipped with Havas, which will then be improved in a couple more years, and then we are working also on further regulations on that. The colleagues from industry that have already talked are very much aware of it. Thank you so much, and hopefully I have not bothered you much with my comments.
Oh, not at all. No, it's very helpful to know what's going on.
Okay, thanks Andreas for the clarifications. And a question here and then behind. Yes.
Yeah. In fact, it's not a question. I would like a little bit to react. Mr. Taverne from ETRMA. We are from the tire industry. So first of all, the tire is a very complex product, and you know, there are very different characteristics, and three are labeled. You have the rolling noise, you have the grip, and you have the rolling resistance. And in fact, those three characteristics are, unfortunately, they are antagonistic. And then, if you add the wearing phenomenon, which is also related to safety, because without wear, no grip. So it's very complex. By the way, just to let you know that what you mentioned, that your tire fitter said, okay, probably your tires would wear more with low noise tires. I'm not sure that statistically this would be okay. It depends on whose kind of tire you are buying. Premium tires, Chinese, premium tires, non-premium tires. No, but it's true that let's say when you make tests on not on wear, because for the time being there is no harmonized wearing tests, but if you just take the three other characteristics and then you look at the difference between premium tires and non-premium tires, then you will see that there is a real difference. And so it's very complex first. But the tire is not only, could cause noise. They are, in fact, by reusing end-of-life tires in asphalt, so in modified bitumen. We call it rubberized asphalt. In fact, you then use the viscoelastic properties in order to absorb the noise. Yeah. And this, let's say, this is a solution. So the tire may be a cause, but it might also be a solution. Thanks. Anyway.
Yeah, I think we can leave it. I think from the time we have time for one more question, and then I would like to wrap up, unless anybody has then still a last urgent one. But for the moment, yes, one last one behind, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation you gave us. I'm from Sofia municipality, Bulgaria's capital. I was just wondering, do you have any knowledge of cities consulting the commission or other authorities of the union too, in regards to designing public spaces in relation to public noise, in relation to noise pollution or not? Do you have any knowledge of that?
Not so much about consulting the commission, but I think the Environmental Noise Directive can take a lot of credit for getting people to think about quiet areas. Because it's overtly mentioned about protecting quiet areas in agglomerations in cities. And they are almost inevitably public spaces, so places that people can go to which are less noisy. That has spawned a huge industry in looking at the whole question of soundscape, and others have called it the positive sound or positive aural environment. So that we are no longer just spending our time trying to make less noise, but actually trying to manage the sound that we hear. In the UK, there are researchers that, for example, have found that if you place a waterfall in a city square, it has the effect of masking the traffic noise, and people prefer it. You don't actually have to have those spaces quiet in the sense that if I stop talking now, this room is pretty quiet. It just needs to be less noisy than if you're next to a road. So Bernhard could obviously say what's happening at the Commission level, but all I would say is that with thanks to the Environmental Noise Directive, all this effort is now going into looking not just to reducing, if you like, bad sound, noise, but actually promoting good sound, as in public parks and so on.
I think, yes, one last question from Claudia, please.
No, I'm Claudia Fusco, DG Environment, so European Commission. I just wanted to reply to your question and maybe also invite people here to do something. So on the network, we want to mention two things. We have an expert noise group where we also discuss several issues, and including, of course, how to better implement noise. Then we do have a network of cities, but this is in the framework of the Green Cities, Green Capital Awards and Green Leaf Awards that we ran in our unit, Bernard and myself. And there, of course, the cities which apply for this award, they have also to show how well they are implementing, the noise directives and regulations. So I think I can also put you in contact with these cities. Some of these cities, maybe they can share their best practices. This can be useful. And my last comment would be more an invitation, because I listened very carefully. It was super interesting, also in terms of really listen careful to noise that we are, exposed to every day. And I think, I don't know how many people here there are also from city administrations, but there are certainly people from industry, I heard, and I think we have to work all together also to make this issue more visible, because it's not, as you were mentioning rightly, perceived as such. Yeah, so there is a lot of work to do, and implementation is still key, I think, also. So there are many things we can do from Brussels, but we need also the support from the local level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this wraps it up quite nicely and gives me a good moment to close the session, which I would like to do, first of all, by thanking Stephen, as well as Paul and Alex and Luis for the... for the excellent presentation. To all of you, I would like to remind you, please bring back your headsets if you have borrowed some. Feel free to tweet or to network via ConnexMe, and I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you very much, and have a nice lunch.